Hey everyone, it's Jim
And Charles.
from Valves and More, an online vintage tube store. And today in Tube Lab number 215, we're going to talk about how to get started or how to set up your very first tube amp. And the idea came to us, of course, because the Black Friday sale just ended.
And we got a lot of messages and probably a lot of orders from first-time tube amp owners. And we like to help people out whenever they're just getting into the hobby.
Yeah, so those amps have either just arrived or they're just about to arrive. I know you just can't wait to hear that thunk at the door. Or you've picked up a great used tube amp locally, and you're just trying to figure out how to get going. So we'll try to answer as many of those questions as we can and try to keep you out of trouble. Or if you're a golfer, out of the weeds. But first, caution everyone, electronics and tube amplifiers can have very high voltages present, which can be lethal. Exercise extreme caution when working around them. Always consult a professional technician when in doubt. Well, last week's episode on fraud was a bit of a downer, to say the least. So today we thought we'd do an episode that's going to be a bit of fun, and everybody can join in the comments. In fact, we should talk a little bit about comments before we get going. Comments are for essentially our family group of friends and followers, and they are not meant to be adversarial.
Yeah, we want people contributing good things on there. We don't want people arguing or putting up information that is irrelevant or opinion-focused.
Or linking to their own particular website and writing on top of ours. That's really not on.
Yeah.
And if you've got some nasty things to say,
keep them to yourself.
Yeah. I was going to say close yourself up in the washroom and do some ranting for a while. But don't do it online, and certainly don't do it on the channel, because nobody appreciates that. Okay, I think we got that out of the way.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to actually use the new Rocket preamp that is actually going out to test builders this coming week. And they're going to get an email soon. We're really close to being ready to ship.
We're just buttoning up the last few things.
But we're going to use it as an example because we just finished tightening up the operating manual, and we're really familiar with it. It's nice and small, fits on the screen. It's only got a couple of tubes, but it covers pretty much most of the standard bases for a small tube amp. But a lot of people who are getting into tubes for the first time start with something fairly small and manageable. If you've got a big, complicated monster, most of what we say is going to apply, but some of the things you'll have to read the manual. And so what's number one on the list? Read the manual. And when you're done reading the manual,
you should read it again.
You should read again.
Ideally, you should have read it before you bought the amp, too.
Yeah. So here's the manual for what we call the Rocket. And it's going to be very similar to most manuals out there. Some Chinese manuals and some really small amp manufacturers may not produce something as professional looking as this.
Or anything at all.
But go with what you've got. And if you have any questions, some of them hopefully will be answered today. And join a tube amp group particularly on Facebook. They are filled with individuals who know their stuff, will jump in and lend you a hand. They'll be happy to lend you a hand. But here's a pro tip. When you're making if you're on any kind of group, always stick to one question at a time, and if you can put up a picture of what your question is related to,
either on a schematic or an actual build or a new amp or anything like that.
Yeah, and if it's a general question about a particular amp and it's not anything to do with what is this switch for, take a picture of the amp so people can get oriented and clue into what you're talking about. So anyway, we got a nice little index. Boring. We have a nice little introduction letter, more boring stuff. But here's where every single manual you've ever looked at will have a warning page. Now, if you're buying a cordless drill, you probably have skipped through this and said, yeah,
It's a drill. Don't drill myself.
yeah. But for tube amps, particularly if this is your first tube amp, read through the warning list. There might actually be something in there that you weren't aware of that you have to be careful of. Yeah. All good amplifiers will have a features and specifications page. Those are interesting, but you really don't need to know what's in those features to fire up the gear the first time, but you do need the operating guide. And in our case, we do a step-by-step, 1 to 11. We couldn't come up with a nice even number, so, well, it's 11. And then we do some very specifics that are particular to the preamp that you might want to take a look at and study a little bit so you know what, even though it's a very simple preamp, it's important to understand what everything does. So this, pay particular attention.
Especially whenever you're trying to integrate a new piece of tech into an existing system. You need to know all the ins and outs to it, how it's designed to work, what kind of configuration you have to have it in. It's really important to make sure it works right.
Yeah, and here's a pro tip. Before you buy a new piece of gear, you should have done all of that work.
Yep.
But if you've gotten to this stage and you haven't done it, well, now's the time to do it.
Better late than never.
Now, in the case of our kit amps, we always have published and made public for free a full set of schematics. And I mean full. They're absolutely complete. You could build the identical amp if you followed the schematics and you knew what you were doing, of course. That's not that common anymore. But back in the day, a lot of equipment was supplied with schematics actually glued onto the back at some point. In fact, Charles just got a new tester in.
Yeah, we were showing it last week, the TV7C.
Yeah, and that's in addition to your earlier version, which is the
I177B. They were both military testers, and both of them have in the case of the I177, a Bakelite schematic on the inside, while the TV7 has a plastic one to make sure it's moisture resistant.
So those days of gluing schematics onto backs are pretty much long gone. But if you have a vintage tube amp, you may well have a schematic on the back if it's big enough. And if it's vintage, you may well be able to get the schematic online.
All the popular ones out there, people have either reverse engineered them or the schematics were already around.
Yeah, but if you've got something really modern, nobody publishes schematics except for us, as far as I know. There's probably a few smaller boutique tube amp and kit amp manufacturers that do that.
Yeah.
Anyways, we better get moving because they're just itching to turn this bloody thing on.
Okay, so you've read the manual, you know how it all works. What do you do next?
Well, you want to plug tubes in, don't you? But the tube sockets are not broken in. They're brand new. The receivers are going to be tight. So without anything plugged in, this is where the IEC power cord goes right back in here. I've got one actually right here. So whenever you're working on your gear, never ever have it plugged in. That's
just good practice.
Safety rule number 1. So we always have junk tubes lying around. I mean, we throw out thousands of tubes every year as we sort through the dross to find the gems. So we would just grab a junk tube with good solid pins. You don't want a junk tube with pins that are all bent to rat shit. That will do you harm, not good. And if you're buying tubes from us and you do need a break-in tube, just drop us a note and say...
can you send me a junk tube?
Yeah, and we've been doing that for years. And it's just not a problem. It won't cost you anything. Just let us know what you need, whether it's a miniature 9-pin or an octal. Those are never a problem.
It's better to see them get some use breaking in a socket than getting thrown in the trash.
Okay, so line up your pins carefully. And just work in that tube. Notice how you do not want to rock this heavily. This is just a little wiggle. Just a little wiggle, and it's in. Now, don't force the tube. If it's not going in easily the first time, then you're going to do it again. So I've got a lot of weight on the amp because these are pretty much brand new sockets. They have been in the system, so they have had tubes in, but they're still really tight. Now, tight is good because you want to have a good electrical contact. Because never forget, the tubes are...
the amplifiers.
Yep. What? You're saying? Hang on a minute. I just paid $1,000 for a big piece of metal. This is the amplifier. No, it's not actually.
That's all the parts that you need to make the amplifier work.
The tubes are the amplifiers.
Yep.
Yeah. Unless it's a hybrid amp, and we're not talking hybrids, but if it is a hybrid amp, then some of the components in there are solid state, and some of those components are also amplifiers.
Okay, so you want to break in both your sockets.
So we probably would put this in 2 or 3 times and pull it out carefully. And now we're ready to rock and roll, aren't we? Well, actually, hang on a second. We have to open up the manual and see what the heck is the tube that goes in V1. Now, on this kit, if we were to flip it over, and I think I will, you'll see on the back, can I get that to focus, Charles?
Bring it back down.
There we go. So we've got a list of all the tubes, and we actually have a special label on it for ourselves because this was kit build number 1. This is the build that actually we built and filmed and became the build series.
Mm-hmm. And we have an earlier prototype sitting around that actually looks identical to it, so it's good to have them labeled.
Yeah, so if we looked at the
go.
manual, we would know that V1 takes the 6N1P and a whole series of other tubes. But we happen to have a 6N1P-EV, and the manual tells us that that is the preamp tube, and it goes into V1. Most amps will have V numbers. That tells you that valve number 1 takes this tube, and because we've broken it in the socket, it's going to go in quite easily. Now, if you didn't have a junky cheap tube or a junk tube lying around to break in the socket, just be really careful. Take your time. You're not going to use your good tube to break in the socket. Just get it in there and call it good. Don't fool around. And the same for V2. The manual tells us that the 6N6P is the only tube that goes in that socket. And this big sucker is the 6N6P. Now, we always ship tubes with our product code number on it, and you can go to your invoice and line up the product code number that's on here. We call it a VT number, a vacuum tube number. And you'll be able to actually see, oh, okay, this is VT number something something, and I'm looking for that number.
Yeah, sometimes the labels are a bit faded on the tubes and difficult to make out. These ones are actually just fine, but it's good to be sure.
Okay, now here's something that is really important. It's not acceptable, safe, or even advised under any circumstances to put junk tubes into your new amp. Now, you can get good tubes almost anywhere. Just make sure that they're the right tubes, that they're tested, and that you've bought them from somebody you've trusted. Last week we did a whole episode on fraud. So if you want to know the ins and outs of buying tubes,
go watch last week's episode.
Yeah, it's a real depressing thing. So I don't know. I think, your favorite beverage at hand before you even turn it on.
So the basic idea is that you don't want to take a risk with your new amplifier and tubes that are going into it. You don't want to experiment if you're not familiar with experimenting with different types and know that it can handle it. There was a case recently where somebody was asking for help with their 12-volt filament heated amp, and they were trying to run 6-volt tubes in and wondering why they weren't quite working right.
Yeah.
So don't put anything in there unless you're sure it's going to work.
Yeah. Now, a lot of amps will have tube rolling options, which is fabulous because remember, the tubes are the amplifiers. So if you roll in, let's say, a different Voskhod tube or a different... this amp can actually take the 6DG8, which is a wonderful tube.
Yep.
And the higher spec version of it, the 6922, can take a whole bunch of tubes. And a lot of amps are similar in that fashion. And the really good the really good amp manufacturers, they'll give you a list because it's to their advantage to really show off the tubes that you can safely roll in. And with that list, you'll be able to shop. And when you roll in a different tube, you change the sonics of the amp. Now, sometimes it's going to be a very subtle change, and sometimes
it's going to be dramatic.
It's going to be dramatic. And sometimes it'll be good, and sometimes it's going to be bad. And sometimes it's just going to be...
It'll depend on the music, maybe.
I was just going to say sometimes it's going to be bloody marvelous. and sometimes it happens that way. I mean, I'll hear a shout from Charles in the music room, "Dad, you've got to come and hear this." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, I'll come and hear this." Sit down, and he's like, "Listen to the bass with these tubes in." And I'm like, "What tubes have you got in there?" And it's like, "Yeah, look at what I found."
Yeah, I'll usually make him guess.
Yeah, and sometimes I get it.
Yeah.
And sometimes he's just made an absolutely marvelous discovery, and you probably will have heard about it. Okay, enough yapping. Let's head over to the music room and get this sucker plugged in. Okay, so we've just brought in the Rocket Preamp into our system, and back in the lab we forgot the absolute number one rule. Charles, what's the number one rule?
No dropping the tubes.
No dropping the
amp,
tubes.
Really.
Well, don't drop the amp. But if you drop the tubes, there's a very good chance that you'll kill the tubes. So, so don't do that. So let's just get it plugged in. So everybody pretty much knows how to cable in. So the right channel is going to be red.
And this is going to depend on your amplifier, of course. If you have a balanced input, you'll have a different type of cable.
Yeah, if you are, in fact, I got this crossed over. If you are running balanced cables, RCA cables are called unbalanced because they're essentially single-ended. So there's one signal path on the conductor with a shield ground return around it. And balanced cables will have a positive or hot and a negative or cold, as well as a shield around it. And so just if you are working, RCA cables are RCA cables. So decent quality RCA cables, you do not need to bring a satchel full of cash to buy good RCA cables. They're not expensive. Just don't buy cheap stuff. But if you are working with a balanced interconnects, do your research. Make sure you have the right balanced interconnects, because there are a lot of variations. There's standards, but then there are people that do variations. So yeah, so be careful about that. So this is the input from our phono preamp coming in. We've got two inputs. I'm going to hit, there's a selector switch, so I'm going to designate the front pair as our inputs. Now I need to connect up the outputs. These are going to go to the monoblocks. You can't see them, they're over on the floor. And again, there's a right and a left cable for that.
And this could be very different in your system if you're getting it set up. You might have an integrated amplifier, you might not have monoblocks, you may have a stereo power amp, or maybe a headphone amp that's going to output for you.
Yeah. Now, here's another thing to be really careful about is always, always turn your volume off or down to zero. Now, if you've got a digital switching preamp, then you actually can't actuate the volume unless it's actually plugged in. But with any luck, the default is zero. So hopefully you're okay there. And if you're not sure, don't plug in your power amps until you get your preamp turned on and you get the volume down to zero, because any new piece of kit in the system needs to be introduced carefully. When I had the shop years ago, and I brought in a machine that had 600 volt 3-phase motors on it, and you weren't sure which way the machine was going to actually turn when you fired it up the first time. You disconnected the drive belts and determined that before you actually turned the machine on. You could just destroy the thing. And audio systems are like that as well. So introduce something carefully, methodically, take your time. If you're not awake, then wait till you are awake. Okay, so we're going to get the IEC plugged in. Notice how we're doing everything sort of carefully, step by step. Because I want to play some tunes, I'm actually going to turn on the phono. I've got our monoblocks on, but you're not going to actually turn them on until now. Or if you have a stereo integrated amplifier and you're just feeding through the preamp for some color, like a buffer, that's just fine. So it's time to turn on your amplifiers. Now, if they have a volume control, get them down to 0 as well. I think you're getting the picture. We don't want any loud noises to hit the system and destroy a speaker driver.
And this is particularly important with headphones. If you have a headphone amplifier or a headphone output and you're about to turn things on for the first time or check for noise,
okay,
you don't want to go deaf.
Okay, so yeah, so that's something important that we can show right away. So when we're doing prototype work with headphone amps, this is how we check for noise. We either will have the headphones not on our head but nearby, and of course with a headphone amplifier, when we're doing an initial startup test, we put the cheapest pair of headphones that we've got. I mean, not a pair that we aren't sure work well, but just the cheapest pair. And when I'm doing initial testing, this is how I load them. I load them above, and it looks a little funny, so you can laugh if you want. Charles is really having...
Or you can have it around your neck too if you want to look a little less goofy.
You could have them down here as well. The idea is they're not on your ears, because the last thing you want to do is create some deafness. You can't get it back. So anyways, just be really careful with headphones, and I mean really careful. One of the things that we do by mistake occasionally is when we're doing some testing is we actually leave the volume up and forget to turn it down. So always get your volume down to 0, particularly when you're doing some testing. So we're going to power it up. The volume's on 0. This preamp actually has 2 levels of gain, so I've actually got the bypass off, which is low gain position. Your preamp or piece of gear will probably be different, but it's always worthwhile.
Yeah, whatever options it has that you can configure before startup, you always want it in whatever the safest position is possible.
Now you might see that I've got an extra pair of RCA cables, and that is the feed from my reel-to-reel, and that's a story for another day. I was listening to some pre-recorded reel-to-reel tapes last night. So, and okay, so the very first thing you want to do is listen to your speakers for noise. Obviously, if you've got a big problem, you've got sparks, smoke, fire.
Stop watching this video and turn off your amp.
Well, unplug it from the wall as fast as you can.
Yeah.
And then deal with the situation from there. But the first thing we do, most gear is not going to be a problem like that. So we can actually see the tubes are lamped. I don't know if you can see it on camera. That means that we've got power to the filaments, and if the tubes are correct and the voltage is correct, then they won't look like giant light bulbs. If they are glowing incredibly bright, then that's a good indication you've got the wrong filament or the wrong tube. So watch out for that. With power tubes, if they're glowing a little bit red inside, that's normal. But if they're glowing, you know, like a
bright
dwarf
cherry red.
Yeah, what's it called? A dwarf sun that goes kind of red.
Yeah.
Yeah, if they look like a dwarf sun all enveloping them, shut off right away because you've got a problem. So the first thing I like to do is I like to listen for the noise floor. So I get fairly close to the speakers, which are actually, they're just over here. And I don't hear anything. So that's a really good sign. So I'm going to actually, now we've got no music coming in. I'm going to bring the volume up to about 1/4. I still can't hear a thing. I'm going to bring it up to 1/2. I'm just starting to hear the noise floor slightly. Now this is a very high gain preamp, and probably nobody will ever have it at half volume except to drive a very difficult power amp. And now I got it up at full volume, and now I can start to hear the electronic noise in the area.
And also the noise floor from the preceding amp. So
Yeah.
if you want to isolate it, you can actually just disconnect the inputs, or in our case, we can switch it to the center position to cut it out.
Yeah, so we can actually hit the détente switch on the input, and I can bring it up to maximum so I don't have an input. Remember, in your system, everything in the signal chain, so starting at your DAC, your turntable, your cartridge, your reel-to-reel, your cassette deck, whatever you've got, your CD player, your computer, everything in the system from the beginning to the end introduces noise. And the noise is accumulative. So in a gain stage like a preamp, this is a control preamp, the Rocket. This universal phono preamp is a phono preamp, but this is a very high gain device. So even the tiniest amount of noise floor gets amplified again and again and again in the system. And eventually you're going to hear it. So I was at maximum volume with no signal in, and we couldn't hear a thing on either channel. That's a very good sign. So
Make sure you switch the inputs back over. There we go.
So if I was getting ready to start playing my first piece of music, and I would have chosen that really, really carefully, and this is one of our sort of our go-to test tracks. I would start with the volume at about a quarter. You don't want it too loud.
George Benson.
And then you can bring it up. Oh, I love the opening of this. The high frequency capture off the drum kit is just wonderful. Anyways, it's one of the reasons why we use it as a test album. And then the bass line that comes in is just superb. I'm not going to play the whole record for you, but that just gives you an idea of how we start. Now, listening, critical listening, of course, means I'm going to be back in my center listening chair. I'm going to be listening to both channels in stereo, and that is a discussion for another day. Let's head over into the lab and see what came in. Okay, Charles, it looks like you got some seriously old vintage tubes out.
Yeah, so we haven't had a lot coming in lately, but what we do have is a lot of beautiful vintage 12SL7s that we've been going through in preparation for the modern line phono kit that's going to be following the Rocket soon after it's released.
Yeah, in fact, we just sold one of the classic line versions of it to a gentleman, and I gave him the option of the 6SL7, that's the 6-volt filament, or the 12SL7, that's the 12-volt filament. And I said, you know, if you go with the 12-volt tubes, they're less expensive, and we have a better selection of the early types. Yeah, so he went with the 12-volt tubes, and that meant that Charles had to go into the 12-volt bins.
Oh, well, I had a lot of fun with it, because look at the stuff that I found in there. So we have, starting over here, we have a couple of different tongue saws. We have an early version. This is... Is
that a smoke glass?
Maybe not smoked. It's got this black banding around it.
Yeah, it's a coated glass. Those are rare tubes.
Yeah, there's a 6SN7 version of this as well that is incredibly rare and sought after. And look at that. You can see the round plates sort of back to back in there. There's not a whole lot that you can see otherwise thanks to that black glass, but they are definitely distinctive looking.
And I think you've got the later version, the tall boy.
Yeah, and this is also really interesting just on its own because it looks like it essentially has something like a 12AX7 plate inside of it. Isn't that neat? So those are a couple of really interesting tongue saw tubes and that I found in there, and we have enough of them to make some beautiful match pairs.
Now, of course, if your amp uses a 6SL7 and it doesn't have a switch for the 12-volt filament option, then of course you can't use these.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the reasons why we call a lot of our kit amps universal types is because they can use 6-volt tubes or 12-volt tubes.
So that you can use these guys.
Yeah. And all you have to do is change the filament switch mode supply, and which takes about 3 seconds, unless you drop it on the floor, in which case you have to call over your son to give you a hand.
Yeah, and fish it back up. Take a look at this beautiful old Sylvania box. It's one of the older types that's out there. I think there was maybe one logo and version that was before this guy, and
is that the full chrome dome version of the tube?
Take a look at this.
That goes back to the late 1930s, folks.
This is the kind of chrome that you get on a tube whenever you want to make sure you're never losing your vacuum on it.
Yeah, I think that tube may have been made into the very early 1940s.
Yeah, we do have some Lochtel versions of these, or we did. We may have sold them all out already, but you can't even see anything about the construction in this. Look at that.
Yeah, and of course this goes back to a time period in which tube manufacturers didn't have as hard a vacuum available to be applied when a tube was completed and installed in the glass. And they weren't really sure how much gettering was necessary. So some higher quality manufacturers just didn't fool around.
They just overdid it.
They just overdid it because it doesn't hurt the tube to have extra gettering, which will help maintain a vacuum over the long term. Okay, what else have you got, Charles?
We've got the next version of the Sylvania here, and this is sort of the contemporary of the famous bad boy 6SN7s. This is the 12SN7. So there's another beautiful vintage box.
So it's got the same box type, and it's got the same elevated plates, though because it's a high gain tube, it's an oval plate structure with the waste chrome.
Yeah, so it has a foil or a plate getter.
Oh, you can see it right through there, I think. You had it on camera a second ago.
Maybe, yeah. You can kind of see it in the back. Yeah. And those are consistent with all the tubes that have a huge amount of waste chrome. Like this guy almost certainly has a plate or a foil getter on the top here. Many of the Lochtel tubes do, and they tend to have stronger getters. And these are just wonderful sounding tubes if you can get them new old stock. Like a lot of high gain tubes, they once they're abused a bit, they can be a bit noisy or microphonic.
Yeah, and for a high gain tube, that's pretty much death. But even the 6SN7, once it starts to make a little bit of noise, and the famous bad boys are one of the worst for that.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily because the tube was a bad tube. It's just that they've already seen a full service life by the time they've become a pull, and some salvagers pulled them out and resold them. So
there's also the problem of using them in a modern amp that wasn't designed to run a GT tube.
Yeah, you can't. Now, the 6SL7 GTs is the only generation that was ever made. There's some higher spec, mil-spec tubes like the WGT version, which are actually very different in how they're built.
And the construction did change over time, so it's possible that they improved the reliability of them and the ability to handle voltage, but the spec sheet was never updated.
Yeah, it stayed exactly the same. And you got a really interesting one.
Yeah, so this one is actually something new to us entirely. I found one of these in the pile, and then I started finding more of them. And this is National Union. And National Union is a very early manufacturer. They didn't make tubes for very long. I think they might have been bought out by somebody at one point.
Yeah, and I think the plant was set up in the early days of the Second World War, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to guess. No, I can't guess. I forget which of the major manufacturers bought them out.
Yeah, but they made some very different and very interesting tubes. And you can see this one has these extra support rods on there. It has a plate structure very similar to the RCA 6SL7s and 12SL7s.
Is it labeled as a mil-spec tube?
I don't think so, but it does have this interesting label on here where they gave you a white spot for marking the date it was purchased and the date it was last tested.
Yeah, and if you've ever handled military equipment, including tubes, there's often... They have often slapped on proper labels to identify when it was last inspected, when it was last tested, what the testing numbers are, when it was last calibrated, if it's a tube tester or a piece of equipment. So with all that reinforcing, I would suspect that this was actually built for the war effort.
Yeah. And we actually haven't listened to these guys yet, so I'm going to probably try and get these tested up later today and maybe get a couple in the system and see what they sound like. I'm hoping for something nice.
Yeah, so I would take away from this, and if you've followed this channel for any length of time, you know that we're huge advocates of using the 12-volt versions of common 6-volt tubes because they're available. They're still available, believe it or not, from the 1930s even. Now, that's not that common, but it's very common for us to have inventory from the 1940s that's new old stock, new in the box. Now,
the most modern tube in the pile here was probably this guy, but otherwise everything in here would have been early 1950s or earlier production.
Yeah. Now, don't expect a box from the 1930s, even a box in the 1940s, to look very good because we're talking about an 80-plus-year-old
piece of cardboard.
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, if we compare the box to how your grandpa is holding up, the box is actually holding up pretty darn good. Yeah.
Yeah, but you can see, like, this is a really early one, and this is the nicest one that we could find, but look at how it's just falling apart.
Yeah.
This is just, it's a shame to see, but it's amazing that this has survived that long to begin with.
Yeah, and we can have a little bit of fun with Grandpa because he doesn't watch our channel. I don't even know if it
Not
exists.
yet, anyway. We might get an angry call at some point.
Yeah, but he's still sharp as a tack. He actually helped us do the corporate taxes the other day,
Yep.
and I don't know if we could have done it without him because
Yeah, he was a big help.
Yeah. Anyways, if you stayed till the very end, here's some discount codes to help you out. And we can reach almost everybody with flat rate $20 shipping. And if yours is $150 or more after discount, the shipping's on us, folks. And there's a secret code that is fairly easy to figure out. And during normal times, a lot of people grab it and cost us lots of money. And I'm really for it because that's a good sign. That means you're watching the channel or you're a returning customer. And yeah, that's what the codes are for. Stay safe, everyone. This is Jim.
And Charles.
Signing off. Cheers, everyone.